Okay, great. This is the Just Transition Subcommittee meeting of the Vermont Climate Council on Thursday, March 25th. Welcome, everyone. What a gorgeous day. I can't imagine any of us want to be inside on our computer right now. But we're going to have many more of those days, so it's okay. That's what I'm telling myself. I'm actually not sure if we yet have a quorum, actually, so maybe as a first order of business, I can just run through the roster to see who's here before we launch into our agenda. So, one second, I see Sue and myself, I see Kelly, and I see Jennifer. Is Chris, are you here yet today? Okay. Kaya? Okay, how about Beverly? Okay, Iris? Nadia?
I'm here, hi.
Great, wonderful. Virginia, I know wasn't able to join us today. Danielle, I see you. Good afternoon. Eris? Okay, so I'm counting Danielle, Nadia, oh, here comes Chris, Jennifer, Kelly, myself, Sue. So I think that gives us enough with Chris joining us to consider a quorum. Okay, wonderful. So we have, I think we have a great agenda today, and I think as our first order of business, we need to approve that agenda. So I'm gonna just do that, and then today, so it was attached to the meeting invite, so I'll just walk through it quickly. We need to approve our minutes. Then we're going to spend a lot of today's meeting really in conversation with one another, thinking about our sort of work ahead, and just trying to connect with one another and sort of where we're coming from in this work. And we've asked David to facilitate that conversation today, really so that Sue and I can fully participate as members in the conversation as well. So David's joining us to do that. Of course, Jane's going to give us some general updates from the Climate Council, and then sort of wanted to start to get into this conversation around some draft principles. And then that's really, we wanted to just make sure we had enough time for that core work as foundation work for our subcommittee today. And so that's what we've put out there. Any comments on the agenda? Any other items? Okay, and Sue has a, yeah.
Sarah, I just have a couple of announcements to make, and I could do that maybe at the beginning of Jane's thing, or just, kind of right now, whatever you're.
Well, let's approve the agenda in the minutes, and then you want to jump in with announcements. That would be great. Yes. Because we do have a little business as it relates to our membership as a subcommittee, so that'd be great. So not hearing any comments on the agenda, I'm going to assume this is what we're moving forward with, and we've adopted the agenda. And then hopefully folks have had a chance to review the minutes. I'm realizing that those are not hyperlinked in what I shared with you all, but hopefully you know where those are online. Did folks have a chance to look at those minutes, and are we comfortable adopting them? I'm seeing a couple head nods and some thumbs up. Okay, not hearing any objections, we'll consider those minutes adopted. And Sue?
Yeah, I wanted to mention a couple of interesting activities or happenings. First, I have to apologize that I actually have a board meeting tonight and need to leave this meeting at 5:15. I completely forgot when we scheduled these meetings that I have Thursday board meetings once a month. And the other major thing is that I want to just welcome both Nadia and Kaya have stepped up to join our leadership team. Our co-chairs are now a team of 4, and we're really happy to expand that leadership and, of course, diversify the leadership, which is so important for our committee. So thank you, Nadia and Kaya. And I do want to stipulate that that recommendation has to actually be approved by the steering committee. So we're in a little transition moment and hope that that works. It's a little unique, so we do want to make sure that that's in keeping with the council's vision. And then the other really interesting event is that Sarah and I have been thinking a lot about how to help orient us and center us in some of the environmental justice and climate justice work that is been going on. And so we had a wonderful meeting with some academics from the Vermont Law School, Law Clinic on Environmental Justice, as well as UVM. And so we are going to suggest that our subcommittee sponsor a workshop on environmental and climate justice. And I think it'll be really interesting. They're very excited. We anticipate, we decided not to just make it part of our agenda, but actually something for the full council to be invited to, and therefore be an evening meeting, a 2-hour session, probably on Tuesday or Wednesday of the week of April 5th. Isn't that the week? So we're excited about that. I think it'll really help us and help expose others to the lens we are trying to understand and present to them. So that's it. Thanks.
Great. And so I think we were also looking to make sure the subcommittee wanted to do that, sort of officially sponsor this. Yes, we made an assumption that this subcommittee would feel great about that idea, but I think wanting to sort of hear from you all that sponsoring that and inviting the full Climate Council and offering it as a separate meeting makes a lot of sense. And then to hold Tuesday, April 6th or April 7th were the nights that group was available. And they were going to also do some thinking about who else to include. So Chris has his hand raised.
No, I'm thrilled you guys went ahead and pursued that. It just makes me think that this is the kind of thing that hopefully sooner rather than later. I hope we develop an agenda for like public training and outreach just broadly on some broad topics that the council is going to be taking into consideration. I think it's totally appropriate for the council to go ahead and have that conversation, with have a presentation and have that conversation among ourselves first. But in addition to public outreach, seeking specific input on topics, I think, just even sponsoring public fora on a variety of topics that we're dealing with would be really helpful, because if we don't do the education piece and outreach piece, just about even the concepts that we're talking about, it might be difficult to bring the public along on what it is we're talking about. So great. Thank you so much for doing that.
And folks will remember next week, our public engagement consultants will be here, and that will be a core focus of our work at our next subcommittee meeting. So thanks, Chris. Any other comments on that, or? Okay.
I just want to validate that, there's a rich body of work already underway here in Vermont, and frankly, Vermont is well behind other parts of the country. So we wanted to make sure we get exposed to that, and we shared with the folks from UVM and VLS, Vermont Law School, our goal of really helping to orient us and the council as a whole into these principles that we're trying to develop. So a little bit of context setting, maybe kind of scanning what's going on elsewhere as well as here. And I want to mention that Kaya is very involved in some activity around environmental justice currently underway in the legislature. So she will be able to chime in and participate about that. But just that there's so much that we need to sort of try to have a common understanding as we approach this. And to your point, Chris, then we can go beyond that as we think about our public engagement to include that. Thanks.
Great. So with that, so that's exciting. And really glad to be doing that. So with that, I think, David, I'm going to hand it over to you to facilitate the rest of the meeting. I think that's the dance that we're doing here today. So, okay, great, wonderful.
I am happy to help. So good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you. Many of you see you again. As Sarah and Sue mentioned, today is a little different. I'm not normally going to be here facilitating, but I think there's some conversations where Sarah and Sue feel like it'd be better for them to be participating as much as guiding the conversation. So I'll help out today and maybe a few in the future, but it's not going to be the normal state of affairs, I would say. Okay, so we wanted to do a few things. The first thing is we wanted to just start what I sometimes call a connecting question. And this came, I believe this question came from one of you, and I'm trying to remember who.
From Nadia.
From Nadia, yeah, perfect, yeah. And I'm just gonna put this in the chat. I don't know how well you all use the chat function in Teams. I sometimes get a little tripped up by it. It's a little slower. But I just dropped a question in the chat. Can you see it? Not so well. Hang on, let's see if I can do that again, and so you can see it a little bit better. But the question is, what kind of changes do you notice in your community that might be coming from climate change? And how might these be impacting, or might they impact you? Right, and it's just sort of get our minds going that we're in this space of climate change. So let me try to drop it again in there a little cleaner, but in the meantime, think about it. What are you seeing in your community, if anything, that might be about climate change? If it's easier for you to just shout out an answer, that's great too, but we can do it, get more all at the same time if folks put it in the chat. So let me just give us folks a second to think about that. What is going on in your community that might be different because of a changing climate? All right, Chris is putting a little something in there that he's paying attention to right now.
Well, that article, sorry, I plugged that in right as you were asking us to put something in chat. So that's not something directly, but again, it's just a glaring example of ongoing structural institutional racism at the federal level about the wicked low percentage of funding that's gotten to Black farmers.
Yep. Right. Amanda's putting in seeing more Lyme disease diagnoses. Yep.
Are we just putting things in the chat, or are we going to converse?
You can shout out too. It's fine. Go ahead, Sue. Yeah.
I don't know why, but I don't have access to chat in my Teams. But in my community of Waterbury, which was deeply impacted by Irene, flooding continues to be, especially in neighboring Duxbury, roads every season being washed out. And the very vulnerable population of mobile home park dwellers are very much at risk, continuing to be, in spite of our efforts to kind of build back in with greater resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I see another hand. I'm just sort of, Liz, go ahead, please.
Sure. I think it's important too to recognize what we're not seeing as a result of climate change. And one big one from this summer was the lack of fireflies or lightning bugs or whatever you call them. They're an indicator species. And we weren't seeing them down in Delaware where I'm from this summer before I moved here. And I know that was pretty much the case here too. So small example, but definitely goes to show what aren't we seeing is also a big part of it.
Right. Okay. Anything else folks want to mention? Again, this was just to sort of get our heads in the zone. Yep, Kelly Klein's putting something in the chat around what Kelly's seeing around dairy farmers.
Danielle has her hand up.
Danielle, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I was thinking of my community.
Danielle, your microphone's so low, I can't really hear you. Something's going on. Okay, we'll give it a sec. Yeah.
This is Chris. I think there's a general, we talk a lot about planning for community resilience and compact settlement and all sorts of things around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improved mobility, increasing the availability of affordable housing, reducing automobile dependence, being more resilient. But honestly, we lack the detailed planning that's needed to actually figure out like how do compact settlements grow and expand, and so many of them are on rivers and streams and in river and stream corridors. We just lack the detailed planning and design and then the engineering to actually achieve compact settlement. So the path of least resistance is going to continue to be what we've had and what we've always had, and so that's going to be, to my mind, I know that cross sector is going to be taking up municipal and regional planning, but we've really got to up our game on like the actual physical planning and design about where communities can and should grow. And it's really difficult, frankly. I'm supposed to be wearing a municipal hat, to just leave that to the municipalities. Because remember, in the state of Vermont, municipalities, don't have to have a plan. It's their choice. It's their choice, frankly, whether or not to comport with state code. The only reason they have to is if they want regional approval, and all that gets them really is access to certain grants to do more planning or to get designated center of village centers or downtowns. So there's just a lot there that's going to have to be revisited in order for Vermont to actually achieve all these things that we say they're supposed to, and all the other plans that we've already got on the table.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Danielle, did you fix your mic problem?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's good.
I was kind of thinking of my community as the labor community, and specifically my industry in the trades, that electrification has really been brought to the forefront when we talk about climate change, moving away from extractive economy, and just like the number of jobs that have been created in solar and installing heat pumps, electric vehicle charging stations, weatherization, all of that. That's what it brings to my mind specifically.
Yeah, it's happening. It's happening.
Oh.
All right. So that was great. That was a little teaser, right? That was just to get our minds going. And we could go a lot further, but I'm going to stop for now and say, let's move on. Jane's got some updates for us, and then we're going to be talking specifically about the milestones that allow you all to have the most impact on this climate action planning process. But first, Jane, what updates do you have to share today with this subcommittee?
Thanks. Afternoon, everybody. I have two main things to just talk about and be mindful of as you're diving in, especially today. So one, I just wanted to highlight, I feel like after the Climate Council meeting on Monday, if folks weren't able to be there, I think that one of the things that has become loud and clear for many of us, and I'm trying to think about that, and I look forward to the conversation next week with you all with our contractor, is the theme of engagement and how what is required in the statute, but what we really want to do. I think that is a resounding theme felt not only by you all, but across all the subcommittees about what true engagement will mean to have a thoughtful climate action plan. And I felt like that came up a lot on Monday. And one of the things that we were tasked with leaving that Climate Council meeting was the consideration and development of a sort of a table of contents, if you will, an orientation to what the climate action plan will look like so that you all know what you're building up to. And one of the first things that I've been thinking about in order to do that, in addition to just sort of the components of that, is now that we have accepted sort of using the model, some of the modeling for the pathways, the technology pathways coming out of the comprehensive energy plan overlap, we can build a successful timeline around when we're going to be able to know all of the technical analyses that we need to know in order to put our best plan forward. And so what Julie, Secretary Moore, and I have talked about is taking that timeline and sharing it with all of you as sort of a grounding when you're having a conversation about engagement, and sort of at what point in the process, what we'll know in order to have informed conversations with the public, or not informed, obviously, because we also want to do some groundwork ahead of sort of going out and testing things with them all. So I hope to be able to share that and have a meaningful conversation with you all, not to the least also with sharing the sort of table of contents body of the plan and trying to work with you all to think about how your work fits into that. And I think the principles that you're going to start to discuss today will be sort of some of that front and center work in the climate action plan. And then on that theme of the contract and public engagement, I just hopped over from a call with our business office and our director of communications. I'm like super hopeful that we'll be able to have the conversation next week. But there's sort of two things. One of the things our contractor who's thinking about engagement and outreach is doing also is the website. And you got to love the state, but we have this whole separate agency of digital services now, and we're in a public meeting, but it's slow to get feedback on sort of the parameters of how we frame the work in the contract, and we want to obviously make sure we do that component of the contract right. So that I got a caution that we can work really hard to advance the contract to have it signed for next Thursday, but there's a chance we won't be able to because of that component. And then the other thing I just wanted to flag for you all is we're doing our best to, this is from my vantage point, the largest contract I've ever managed for $200,000. And the engagement component of that is quite a lot of money, but yet being mindful of what you're all discussing and thinking about, we don't want to be too prescriptive in it, right? Because we want you all to help inform the engagement and have an iterative process. That's a little hard in a state contract where you need deliverables and timelines. So I'm sort of doing my best to use some of the information they put forward in the proposal as tools for engagement, but also ensuring that there's like check-ins with this committee and A&R staff along the way to ensure the development of those tools is what you all want and what engagement looks like. But I think that'll be something that we'll really need to be mindful of as we start to work with that contractor. And I really hope to lean in on all of you to help formulate what that looks like. So hopefully that'll start next Thursday. And if not, it'll be the following week. So we're super close, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation. So that's all I have for now.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jane.
You're welcome.
Any questions for Jane on those issues? All good. Okay.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay. Great. Excellent. So let's dive into some of the meat of what we wanted to do today, or the thick of what we wanted to do today. And here, the first conversation we wanted to put on the table is one about milestones and the key things that you all can do over the next period of time, particularly until December 1st, where you can have a maximum amount of impact on the development of the climate action plan. And we started talking about this in the last meeting where I was participating with you. And Sarah and Sue have done some additional thinking on that. And so Sarah and Sue, how do you want to put this out there? Do you have a document you want to share as a way of getting people going on this idea of our milestones?
I can share what we drafted.
Okay.
Can folks see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. You want me to walk folks through this a little bit, just to orient them to what we're looking at, David? Is that okay?
I think so. I think so. I'm happy to frame it up as well, right? Because what I heard you all say last week was there's an important sort of short-term need the other subcommittees with some framework, some sort of guiding principle, something that allows them to right away-ish, like within a month or so, to start to have a lens of justice and equity. That so in their creative process and in their analytical process, they have that lens as early as possible, right? So that's sort of one of the things that has to happen. And then as this process goes on, that may evolve into something that looks more like an equity assessment tool or equity and racial and justice tool, right? So that's one line, and that's gonna be one of these columns that Sarah's gonna talk about. And the other thing I heard about was the importance of engagement. And so, Sarah, and with that introduction, I'll say, this is my understanding of how you all see those milestones fitting together and having as much impact as possible.
Yeah, thanks, David. And just to say, I think we were trying to take last week's conversation and then our charter and start to map that out a little bit. And so just offer this as a place to start for this conversation. So I think, I'm going to turn off my camera to turn sideways here. So I think one thing that we talked about was just the need to do more foundation building as our group of bringing our own experiences forward, and then also learning from the field. So that's Sue and I working to kind of organize this other meeting and thinking, and then today's meeting kind of also helping ground us, I think, a little bit was the idea. And there may be some other ways that we want to continue to build that foundation together. And then we thought about really the other work, kind of, as David was starting to say, kind of folds into these guiding principles for the full work of the council, this assessment tool, which in statute is named that we will provide to help, particularly help the subcommittees in their evaluation and analysis of recommendations, although we can certainly do that after the fact and review recommendations as they're coming out, but the idea is to have it more embedded in the process. This piece around supporting inclusive data, which I think was, we all work together to incorporate into our charter.
Sarah, can you scroll down a little bit? Because I don't think we're seeing what you're looking at right now.
Oh, is that helping? And public engagement. So are you seeing this table that says meeting dates? Just transition?
Yeah.
Okay.
We see down to July 8th.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I think, that's what we started to kind of, the final column here, we pulled from some work that Jane did around Gantt charts to just kind of think about the preliminary, and I can send this out to the group, but really the whole thing goes through December. So I'll start backwards. How's that? We adopt the climate plan in December 1st. There's a public comment period that starts in October. You can kind of work backwards and start to see how our work overlays with the full work of the council. So really in August is when we'll really be able to engage more in reviewing recommendations. But if you start to back up a little bit, you start to see that, preliminary plan drafting and feedback on subcommittee work is really intended to start in June, right? So what does that mean for our work as a subcommittee that's trying to put forward an assessment tool or some, specific principles for analysis? So we're thinking that we need to be providing that so that as that work happens over the summer, we've provided that tool probably sometime by June at the latest, so that work can happen over the summer with that tool. Maybe we do it sooner, but we're also trying to be realistic and thinking about this timeline, right? Because it's April next week. So, but then I think also David was thinking, we started to think about, does the subcommittee want to set a goal that really by the end of April, we've provided some draft guiding principles for the other subcommittees' work. And we say draft because those guiding principles can be iterative and we can continue to adapt them over time, but could we set that sort of as an initial target? And then I think this other, there is this public engagement work of which we're a part of, but we'll have a consultant helping to implement, and we can start to map in what that looks like. So I'm going to stop talking there. I just kind of gave an overview of sort of some of our initial thinking around milestones and what our work plan starts to look like. And then obviously there's a lot to fill in here.
Right. Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. So the idea here is just to get our heads around what exactly are we doing here? What are we, right? In addition to the charge that was well crafted, you know, what are the outputs of this process that can really have some timely and powerful impacts on the rest of the overall work on this climate action plan? So as Sarah says, this feels like the beginnings and the highlights, and then there's going to be a little more detail that's put in, particularly in that column in public engagement. There's a lot of detail that'll go in there. Do people have a reaction to this? Are there things that are confusing about this and what it means in terms of specifically the sort of objectives and goals and outcomes that you would do as a subcommittee?
And I want to add, if you don't understand what we're talking about, that's also understood. Start there. This, you know, we're trying to move on something that we really haven't discussed. So our hope is that we actually have a conversation about what we're thinking that we're trying to do, but really where folks are at around this call.
Yeah. Chris?
Just this relates to what we're talking about. I'm nervous. I think we're talking. I forget where we left this with the council as a whole, but I'm nervous that we don't have a labor economist working with us, and wondering if that needs to be another contracted service. Because to my mind, as we're looking at assessment tools and principles and other things, on the economic side of the equation, I'm just feeling like that's a big piece that we're missing as a subcommittee, as a council. I mean, I know we have labor representation, but I'm talking about the data and what it means.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jane, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just science and data is really mindful of that also, Chris, and I did just want to say that I met with ACCD yesterday and a whole consortium of their staff, and one of their staff, Ken Jones, who is an economist who currently staffs the cross-sector mitigation group, has sort of volunteered to also staff the science and data now. He's actually sort of full on offered to be really, thank you, Sarah. I actually, as I was saying it, I was like checking in my mind what the acronym stood for so I could say it. And so he's sort of like broadly available, I think, in his capacity to come and sit in on any subcommittee meeting, and is really interested in helping and participating. So it doesn't get completely at that need, but the only other economist who was nominated through the ranking process happens to work for a consulting firm that is very likely to bid on the RFP for the technical services. So it was like a chicken and egg thing, like if we brought them on a subcommittee, but then they got contracted potentially. So right now we were thinking of really tapping Ken Jones as much as we could. And I think he'd be an appropriate person to come to this group too at times.
Okay, great. What's most confusing?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that real quick? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So are you saying that a potential consulting firm will have that expertise? I'm not knocking Ken's engagement at all. I really appreciate it, but I'm talking somebody who really knows the research, knows the implications, knows what it means for economic justice. So are we talking about we'll have a consultant on board that should have that capacity as well?
Yes, they will have economic capacity. Speaking to like the full breadth of the world in which they work in, around economic justice. I don't know it. I don't know the firm well enough actually to speak to that. But I mean, most of the modeling that we will do as a climate council speaks to the economics of the recommendations that we'll want to consider. So yes, there will be economists brought in on contract.
Okay, just last statement on it. So where I'm going on this too is it's important to know the impact on different sectors, but to my mind, there's a difference sometimes in knowing the impact on labor in those sectors versus knowing the impact on the sector itself. Right. So and knowing the dynamics of labor within that sector, who's going to be impacted the most. And so, I mean, I'm sure we're going to be looking beyond like impact on, I mean, I would hope we're going to be looking like beyond the impact on firms and shareholders and the inputs and outputs of the sector as a whole. To me, the question we've really got to get to when it comes to just transitions is how it impacts households, how it impacts individuals in the different sectors, because those who are already marginal within those sectors are certainly going to be affected the most. I just want to make sure we have a good understanding of that, and I'll be quiet about all that now.
Thanks, Chris, for bringing that up. Okay, if we think about sort of these key moments in time for this subcommittee, for your work, what's most confusing? What would be important to clarify now or have a conversation about now? And no question is, don't be shy here. It's perfectly okay to say, I actually have no idea what you're showing right now. Nadia?
One thing that gives me pause is providing draft guiding principles on April 22nd. And this might just simply be something of syntax. But what I would hate to see is we provide draft principles, and with everyone working on such an accelerated timeline, they get the final ones and it doesn't feel as resonant, or they're not dedicating as much time because they feel as though they've already reviewed something. So perhaps retitling it or reorienting ourselves to providing preliminary principles or key issues we anticipate each subcommittee to address, very high level. So we make sure that they have, again, their attention when they do get the final ones.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there and say, Nadia, I think that was the intent is getting something, even if it's high level. I think that's exactly what you're articulating, knowing that we'll have more work to do. So if whatever the language is that in my mind pushes that idea forward, that there's more coming that you're going to have to be paying attention to. I think that sounds right. I want to make those adjustments.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. Anything else that's jumping out at folks? Sue?
Well, one thought that kind of has come up that we don't have in here, and Nadia, I really appreciate your wording. I think preliminary is a really good word there, because it really connotes that we're beginning this process with you. But I think it's been mentioned, should we then somehow, some of us somehow integrate into some of the work and maybe the meetings of other subcommittees. So I don't remember who or when that may have been proposed, but I wanted to raise it for us to discuss. Is that something we think we could even achieve, and would it be valuable? Should we put that on this timeline?
Kaya?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Sue. That is kind of what I'm thinking. So if we are not directly supporting the other committees with this, how do we help support their implementation? right? So, I mean, I think it ties into both what Nadia and what Sue are kind of raising on this is like, so folks are just going to roll through is what they need to do, and they may or may not really have a good foundation and ensuring that their work is checking for that. So I do appreciate that there's almost a check-in. That's how I see the June, that's how I see the kind of June touch point there, as an opportunity to check in and be like, how's that working out for you? But trying to think through how those committees will be supported and really considering that. I mean, this is the most diverse of all of the subcommittees. And so that voice may or may not be as resonant in other places that people would advocate naturally for that, if they're not thinking to look for the kind of guiding principles that we're trying to provide.
Yeah. And Kaya, I wonder as well as even earlier, like all those dates in May and everything, I wonder if part of that is actually just being inserted into and part of the other subcommittee conversations to provide that support, you know. Kelly?
Yeah, I agree. I think that having some of the other subcommittees are, I mean, I think we're the most diverse subcommittee, and some of the others are sort of seem like they really are lacking in diversity. And so having some folks from this committee being there to at the meetings to say, hey, have you considered this? This is remember these principles. And I think that might really benefit them as they go through their work, so that we don't get to June and have them go, oh, wait, we forgot about all these principles that you handed us, and having someone there all along the way. So if there are people on this committee who are willing to be liaisons with some of the others, I think that we would probably come up with a better product in June if we do that.
Thanks, Kelly. Sue?
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking that May should really be that time that we're all kind of trying to integrate to some other committees. And maybe then when we come together, we have some juice to really discuss about what's lacking and how do we even help think about that. That might be our task in sort of the May timeframe, after we think we understand the principles we want to share, that we actually maybe we should put it on their radars that we're going to actually come and talk about these, one or two of us probably, and then we're going to work with you to think about how it applies. I don't know, just an idea, but putting it on our timeline as a major goal of May.
Cool. Does anyone want to push back on that or have a different view on that? Just to test if that seems like everybody's on board. Kai, is that a new hand or an old hand? Sorry, I'm not sure.
It is an old hand, and I will lower it.
Okay, no worries.
I'd love to make room for other folks that are on the committee that I haven't heard from yet. Yeah. Folks who haven't chimed in, welcome to opine here. What are you thinking? Are you thinking, oh my gosh, this is way too much? Or what's going on in folks' heads? Be interested to know.
This is Jennifer. I would just say that I think that having us in the committees is essential, because I think that we are in a position to speak up and to be focused on that, where the other committees are really, they'll want to, but they won't, because it's not really their charge. So I think that having us in the committees, as much as more meetings doesn't appeal to me, I think that we do. I think it would be a really good thing for us to be there. And even if even if we didn't say anything, just as a reminder, just to be there.
Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. Nadia?
I think also reminding each of the subcommittees that in addition to us being present and providing feedback, that they can also send us questions. So reinforcing that this is an open feedback loop and ongoing questions are welcome throughout the process, regardless of whether or not it's during subcommittee times.
Right. Yep.
If I could just say one more thing about it too, I think that it also sends the message that we're not a separate committee, right? Like equity and diversity issues are not a separate thing. They are embedded in our everyday lives, whether we may see them or not. And some people see them more than others. And I think that it sort of sends that important message.
Nice. Chris?
Just so you know, the cross-sector subcommittee has the second sentence in their charge talks about the need to look at municipal and regional planning. And so I asked Kelly if she would mind if I was the co-liaison to that subcommittee, because what I was tasked with as a member of the council was to represent, municipal interests, and planning looms large among those. So just wanted to, Sue thought that was okay. Just wanted to run that by you guys to see if there were any questions or concerns.
Great. Anybody have a problem with that? Or have a suggestion around that? Great. And I think as we get closer towards this, folks can then decide where they'd like to spend, in which subcommittee they'd like to be more present. I do think there is a guiding principle among our guiding principles of a reasonable number of meetings in effort. So I think that is part of what you have to manage too. So all these dates that are in there, you could just get rid of some of them and say, these are the weeks we'll be working with the other subcommittees. Okay, great. So anything else on this sort of timelines having an impact, embedding yourselves in with the work, Sarah?
Yeah, sorry, I raised my regular hand. I'm very bad at raising the computer hand.
Yeah.
I think I just want to, this has been great to dig into this a little bit more. And I'm just wondering if folks, this sort of looking at it in this way makes sense, and we can kind of continue to build and revise in this way, sort of our work plan. And so is the next step then that the subcommittee would say, hey, co-chairs, take this back, and based on our conversation, start to flesh it out a little bit more, and kind of we keep coming back to this group with that. Is that that's how I'm envisioning working with this tool, and the role of the co-chairs in terms of as we think about planning out our work and setting agendas for meetings. So I just want to check in that if that feels like the right direction with the group, or the right approach.
Any reactions to that? Kaya, feel free to jump in on that, or if other folks want to jump in on Sarah's specific question. This feels like the right way to scope your work out. Okay, great. Kaya, was there something else you want to say?
I just wanted to see if we needed to lift anything in the chat. I noticed that someone had mentioned maybe the Beverly Little Thunder might be on, but by phone. So if there's folks that can't see the screen, and I'm putting in other ways if it might be helpful. I'm just noticing that Abby Willard had put in around asking about the equity assessment tool and circumstances that much of the data required in the form is not available to BIPOC and in other communities. So how do we want to address the lack of available and sufficient data? So just to be clear, so again, you're speaking specifically to the equity assessment tool and not to the census level race data that we'll be trying to acquire through the separate process. Does that sound correct, Abby? Am I rephrasing that appropriately?
Yeah, Kaya, I think that is appropriate and accurate. I think that having used the equity assessment tool for some budgeting purposes, there are questions that are asking for data that we did not, at that time at least, have access to. And maybe there are mechanisms, as you're describing, that would allow us to have access to that data. But if not, and we're thinking of still using assessment tools that are asking specific questions that we don't have the ability to answer, how effective are they as an assessment tool?
Thank you. Thank you. I did have a separate question, though. I'm sorry. I did see I saw someone else's hands go up. I do apologize. So I think it was Kelly, maybe. I apologize. So what I was going to, my other question that I wanted to ask within this space as well is, so we're thinking about both the data, but then there also is actually an RFP that's going to be coming out fairly soon that's looking for data. So I know we're feeling super hungry for data, qualitative and quantitative, but there are responses, as I understand, coming from the state requesting further research on this piece. So building off of some of the good work that we've already talked about that's come out of Rejoice and other places to help us get a better picture of what are the areas of needs, who are impacted communities, and what might environmental justice mean for those groups. So I want to just lift that to say that I at least have an awareness that there's some things happening and moving that while we may not have them in hand at this moment, that they will be happening. So if there's something we can inform on that, then maybe we should consider that. But as far as this particular charge of what we've got in front of us of this little chart, I think it's more speaking to building off of our charter and finding ways for people to be able to use an equity analysis. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kai. Yeah, Kelly?
Yeah, on the subject of data, I just wanted to affirm that that's something I think we need to keep bringing that up, that there might just not be data available to tell us certain things. This came up, it was a glaringly, it was a big problem when we had grants for women-owned businesses and BIPOC-owned businesses as part of the COVID relief, and there's no official list of either. It was a lot easier to reach women-owned businesses because the state has a commission on women. They do not have the same thing for BIPOC individuals, so it was really tough to reach people, and the funds took a lot longer to be granted. So this is something that I definitely want to make sure that we're reminding people of. Like, we may not have the data, we really want to figure out how to get it so that we're able to do the right thing and make sure that people are not negatively impacted because we simply don't know where they are or who they are.
Yeah. Great. All right. I see a few more hands, but it takes me a while. Sue, go ahead.
This is sort of the data question, and I keep raising these maps. And the fact that every other state we've looked at had maps, and the importance of every assessment based on what. And I don't know. I'm interested from Jane, like, how and when do we fit that need or the challenges that exist with respect to the glaring absence of the right data? Where does that fit, and how do we do that? Because I agree, it's not just our assessment tool and our principles, it's really the foundation of how the rest of, I think, these policies and analyses are going to be derived.
Well, I can just speak back to that and just suggest that the idea that you will need help or further analysis or mapping or contracts, there is a space for that, actually, you know, as we move through the RFP process for the sort of first round of technical analyses associated with greenhouse gas reductions. There'll still be a body of work that will likely need to be contracted to enhance and support the work of the other subcommittees. And so I have that sort of being built into a timeline of sort of like, first and foremost, we got to get going with the greenhouse gas modeling, but then recognizing that we need to also ensure that we still have funds left over for additional analyses that are needed. And I see that Kaya sort of, I really like her suggestion in the comment also, and then also recognizing that there, as I've suggested, that I think sooner rather than later, I should bring in the work from our agency that's happening and figure out how that could or couldn't serve this committee and how we might be able to inform that and the mapping that they're doing for that work, since that's already moving forward. So I'll put a pin in that and make sure I follow up on that to bring it forward to you all.
Great. Okay, so data is going to be key, right? And you have a voice in saying what those data needs are. And Jane's got a budget, right? So, you know, those things should come together. And there's other work going on in other agencies or in separately within the state government that's very related. Okay. All right. So let's pivot to the next conversation, but before we do, I was asked to say a word about how the council is doing its decision making and how the expectation from the council around subcommittees as well, in terms of sort of a consensus-based process for deliberating and making decisions. And so I was just going to say a word about it and the way it's been framed up and talked about at the council level, so that you all can decide if this is how, you know, this is what version of this do you want to do amongst you all as you're starting to get into the actual content and you need to deliberate, and it may be challenging, and you'll need to start, you know, making decisions around what really are our preliminary drafts or preliminary guiding principles, right? So let me just share my screen for 1 second and to show you the language that's the full council has been working on in terms of its decision-making protocol. And just give me 1 second. My computer gets super slow when I do this.
David is the biggest fan of Teams that we have.
I have been told by someone on this call that it may be very possible to switch to Zoom in the very near future. So, and I think others perhaps will be excited about that too. Okay, so consensus. The full council is trying to work on what we call a consensus building model, and that means that the decisions that are made are decisions that you all can live with, right? If that's how you're going to go down that road, you need a backup, but in the first instance, that's what you're seeking. But consensus also has an implication on how you do it, right? And the how is important, right? Because the how is how you address differences and how you work through thorny issues, right? And so some of the things that we find to be helpful is to really seek to understand, right? Really ask the question of why in an honest way of saying, help me understand why this is important to you, right? And help me understand what these core concerns are. And then together we can start to creatively problem solve and build some agreements around it. And you always do have the possibility at the end as a subcommittee, if for whatever reason it's not working and you fundamentally have different views on a few issues, on those few issues where you have disagreements, you can share multiple views when you lift things up to the full council, right? Obviously, you want to avoid that if you can, because it diminishes a little bit the strength of your recommendation, the strength of what you're doing. But it is the reality sometimes that there are different views, right? And the full climate council can see those. So that's sort of the you know, what the full council is looking at and is hopeful that you as subcommittees will do as well, right? But let me say something else, which is this is not any old subcommittee. This is the Just Transition Subcommittee. And this subcommittee really focuses on issues that are profound. Profound in how they speak to our identities, profound in how they speak to injustice in the past. And in the face of this level of issue, I find there's another layer that goes on top of this as part of a consensus building model, which is about acknowledging that we have different views and values and identities. And that's okay, right? We're coming from different places in different lived experience. And we have to acknowledge that. And we can't assume that we're all going to be aligned on that because we are of different lived experience, right? And in the face of that, it's our compassion for each other, empathy for each other, and our willingness to continue the conversation that allows us to work through the very challenging issues, which are the ones that we're tasked with or you're tasked with in this subcommittee. So I'll just mention that because these are the toughest of issues. And you know, they are thorny issues that the world is trying to wrestle with, and we certainly are in the US. Okay, so that was all that I wanted to share on that. And I want to just, you know, I'd welcome thoughts and feedback about if that's going to feel right for you all as a subcommittee And I'm just stopping to share my screen so we can look at each other. All right. How's that sound? Does that sound like a pathway for working together, tackling some pretty thorny, some pretty difficult, and pretty powerful issues? What else would make this really work? Any thoughts? Sue, go ahead, please.
I just want to acknowledge that consensus decision-making is something that takes experience and work. And I know, Kelly, you've raised several times training potentially. I went to a Quaker school where everything was, all decisions were made by consensus, and had the experience of being on a disciplinary committee with like the headmaster of the school and my teachers, and I kind of learned how consensus can be manipulated through power dynamics. And I'm super conscious right now of a power dynamic that a white woman of privilege has, and the agency I have just to be speaking too much, frankly, in this group. And I don't know how we do in a Zoom environment, but I know that we have to build trust and understanding. And I guess I would love for any ideas that people might have to help us learn from one another more, so that we can start to have more of a foundation of understanding that I think you pointed out nicely in your slide.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah. Other reactions? Just feel to unmute yourself. Sometimes I can't see hands very well, but feel free to unmute yourself and just speak if you like.
I just jump in. I really appreciate what you just said, Sue. That you sort of hit the nail on the head. I also went to a Quaker school, so I have the experience of real training in consensus building, which is something that so I understand. That's why I keep pushing for it. It's not something that people just know how to do, or they may have misconceptions about what consensus means. So I also appreciate David going through all of that with us. But yeah, the concern, some people are just worried that one person will like be a stickler and stand out and not let, block consensus. But I'm frankly more concerned that people who are naturally or by training more reserved, more quiet, will not feel like they can speak up if they have a problem or if they disagree. And since we're talking about marginalized people and marginalized communities, I want to make sure that potential pitfall of the consensus building model is not one we fall into, where people who are in the habit of not speaking up because their voices haven't been heard in the past don't keep up that habit in this committee at the very least. And so I really appreciate what you said, Sue. Thank you.
Thanks. Other thoughts about this? All right. Okay.
If I may, David, I mean, I don't want to rest on feeling that just because people aren't speaking up doesn't mean that they don't have thoughts on it. Because many of us come from different communities where we may have different ways of doing decision making. So how to ensure that our voices are heard within this varies from person to person. So it's something that we may not want to say we have definitively said we're good with today. Like, I don't know if I'm ready to go ahead and claim that. When we haven't, we don't even have consensus on consensus at this point in the conversation. I want to also honor that, or maybe it's not even honor. I want to clarify, because I feel like I've also heard that there is the potential for members of this particular committee to be able to help inform the decisions beyond just whatever reports we may come out with of the Climate Council itself. Consensus can feel less constricting if we feel like we've done the best we can to do our due diligence of bringing in the voices that are not in the room. And so some of that happens through decision-making power. So I'm still not completely clear on that. I can state that there are members of the BIPOC community that would like for the subcommittees, and especially the ones that have this representation, have the diverse representation, to have a seat at the table for those final decision-making spaces. And I know that may not be how we function as a state, but that's something that is important in building that trust. So I'm just sort of raising that as I'm just thinking and feeling through this, that you know, it doesn't have to be as problematic if we feel like we've done our work, but we can't even say that we've done our work if not even all members of this subcommittee have been able to even weigh in with their voices yet. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it sure does. And it probably is one of these things that folks need to sit with for a little bit, right? And think about what that means. So absolutely circle back with this. And I do know, folks, just because you're not saying something doesn't mean you're not thinking something or doesn't have something to say. Okay.
And can I add something real quick? Because I don't know if I didn't want to come across that I think consensus is a really, really powerful tool. And I think it's a great opportunity. And I just want to make sure that we're using it to really elevate voices and not taking advantage of power dynamics, as Sue said. So I think it's a great, powerful tool, and I've seen it used really, really well. But yeah, I look forward to hearing more about what other people think.
That's great. We can share that slide I did and send that around with the meeting minutes so folks can have it and mull on it for a little bit too. Okay. All right. Any last things on that before we move on to the final piece of our agenda, which is trying to start to tease out the very, very beginnings of what might become our preliminary guiding principles. Anything else before we move on to that? Okay, great. All right, so let's get into it. This is an opportunity for us to start to put on the table the kinds of things that we'd like to see in these guiding principles. In the agenda, there's a couple questions to start getting our minds into it. And those are the ones I wanted to use today. And I'll drop them in the chat again, just so it's there, hopefully in a way that is easy to read. And as we go forward this afternoon, I'm going to be taking some notes, and then periodically I'll share them back so you can see sort of how I've been trying to capture. And then hopefully that's helpful so we don't lose things as we go, as we have a good conversation. All right, so I just dropped, I'm trying to just drop in the chat. There we go. 2 questions that are a way to start to get us thinking about this, right? The first question is, from your perspective, what does a just transition mean for Vermont? What really is it? Can we start to name it? Because from naming it, we can start to define the principles that are the basis of it. And the second question is trying to bring it down to even more tangible level of how will we know if the climate action plan is actually headed towards a just transition. So those are 2 ways to walk into this conversation about just transition and about the principles and guiding principles that you all want to formulate as a group. All right. I wanted to put one more thing on the screen before we get going. And I just was thinking about it before the call. Let me just share my screen for 1 second. And this relates to something that Sarah said earlier. Hang on just a sec. It's going to be a little slow, but it'll come. There we go. when I was thinking about this earlier, I was thinking about these draft principles. These are, we'll call them preliminary, sorry. These preliminary guiding principles are going to come from a few places, right? They're going to come from our experience, our expertise, what we know, our realities, right? They're also going to come by the research and the thinking by others, right? That's the importance of doing this seminar that Sue talked about, right? There's a lot of thinking that's gone on out there on this, and people have written about it. People have put some ideas in paper on this. And at the same time, and the third piece of this triangle is really landing this in the topical areas, in the substantive areas of the climate action plan, and the things that the climate action plan is going to need to look at, right? So the climate action plan is going to be looking at, how do we help people transition the way they heat their homes, right? How do we think differently about where we live, how we get around, right? It's going to be dealing with issues around resilience and decisions that the state needs to make around that. So that substantive focus will also shape how we want to put some principles on the page that will be the most relevant for the work at hand. So this was me just sort of sitting for a second thinking, these are the pieces of the puzzle. Today, we're probably going to be more around lived experience, right? And a little bit less around these other two. And that's fine. We just need to work our way towards a combination of lived experience, what others have already done for us by good research and thinking, and then landing that in a space that makes sense for the content that we're trying to shape in the climate action plan. All right, enough for me. Let me try to drop my screen for a sec. Okay. All right, so this is the part where you all can start throwing some ideas on the table. And maybe that first question is the way to start. What is a just transition for Vermont? And I'd welcome anybody to chime in. You can throw in the chat. You can just unmute yourself and talk. So let's answer that amongst ourselves for a moment. What is a just transition? What are the components of that? What does it mean for Vermont? I'll take some notes while you all talk.
I would much rather listen than talk. I'm going to say a few things and then I actually have to leave. So I'm just going to say quickly what goes on for me. It is, there's been, for me personally, a lot of learning about the depth of our racist country and the implications and why we are as such a disparity. There is such disparity, economic and otherwise. And so when I think about transitioning to a future economy that is just, it's overcoming and making up for essentially so much history that is why we are where we are. And there's a lot embedded in that. But that we, as we go forward, think about solutions that do two things, that advance us in terms of the climate, reducing greenhouse gases, and advance these other important goals of equity and justice at the same time. And I'll just say, and I think that isn't impossible, and it's difficult in the current environment. Because when I proposed in a group of environmental folks the idea of including subsidies for used vehicle, there was a subsidized electric vehicles, all electric vehicles, and the thought was that there's a whole lot of people who will never be able to afford those vehicles, but we could subsidize used vehicles. But they might not be all electric, they might be hybrid and still get us moving. And it took a long time for that idea to be embraced. And so that's just an example of how far we have to go on this and why I'm so happy to be working with you on this topic, and I feel terrible having to jump off right now, but thank you. I'll look forward to the notes, David.
Thanks, Sue. Great. Okay, let's keep moving. Let's keep rolling with some of those thoughts, right? It's about learning about our racism, right? As a country. It's about advancing climate goals together with equity and justice goals. Let's see if we can define those even better. Nadia.
Oh, so I was just going to mention with regard to the question of what does a just transition mean for Vermont, 3 things that immediately come to mind are the identification and the promotion of frontline communities within the principles that we develop, clear definitions on varying equity concepts. And I think is important. Again, there's a lot of nuance to them. We want to make sure that folks are informed and feel that they can best act on our guidance. And I think the third thing that comes to mind is very challenging, but to the extent that we can, is some sort of sectoral nuance. So regulators are going to have a different lens than public utilities and the state legislature, than program administrators. And so to the extent that we can engage that as well, to me, that really means just transitions.
Great. Can you say just one more piece about that final comment you made about the nuance, and say it one more time, because I didn't quite fully understand it.
Yeah, have sectoral nuance. So what equity means amongst regulators at the Public Utilities Commission will differ from what legislative equity looks like, what it means for public utilities and energy program administrators, making sure that they understand that they are vital to this, and to the extent that they have a different needs, we can support and amplify those and address them.
Great, that's clear. Thanks so much. Danielle?
In answering the question, what does a just transition mean for Vermont? Kind of that cliche term of no worker left behind. So making sure that new jobs are created that are family sustaining, offering good wages and benefits, strengthening unions, strengthening communities, having wage guarantees, training and retraining programs. That's all for now, but I'm sure there'll be more.
Great. Great. Other pieces to this puzzle. Jennifer?
Thanks. So generally, I think it kind of conflating the two questions is identification of sort of winners and losers of each identified step that the committees want to take, and also concrete opportunities to reduce the disparities or eliminate them, of course. So requiring the, sort of requiring that analysis. If you come forward that we want everybody to have electric vehicles in 10 years, for instance, or something like that, who's going to have trouble with that, and what are the opportunities to address the disparities?
Yep. Great. Sarah? Sorry, Sarah, did you have your hand up? Oh, wait, you're on mute. Sorry. I can't hear you, Sarah.
Now I'm unmuted. Sorry, I pushed the wrong button on my phone. I think and I said something really meaningful. No, I'm just kidding. Sure. I think I have a fear here, right? I'm thinking about like people who I know that live in Vermont, and how climate action policies feel so much like this elitist thing that is something people, and I know we don't all feel this way, but something people who have time to worry about, and the rest of us are worrying about sort of getting by day to day. And so I'm consciously in my work like aware of this systemic issue we have around inequality and the huge gap between incomes, both racial and economic. And so it feels to me that is like one of the biggest systemic issues that we have, and yet the other one big systemic issue we have is around energy transition, like climate transition, right? And so how could we possibly do one without addressing the other? And it's not as much about like an opportunity in the climate action policy to address issues of social and economic inequality. It's like fundamentally has to be a part of it or it won't work. And for us as a society. So I think that this is my fear, honestly, is that this subcommittee is given this tokenist thing around, we looked at equity issues when we addressed the climate action plan. And I know we don't want that, but that's my fear, is how do we truly make this climate action plan something that will have impact? And it will only have impact if it, at its core, includes a just transition.
Thanks, Sarah. Kaya?
Thank you. I just needed to lift up what was in the chat for those who are joining by phone. I wanted to just raise, it looked like Chris Campany had a description that said that the policies will intentionally result not only in reduction of GHG emissions and more resilient communities, but will result in greater social, economic, and environmental justice, fairness, and equity, as the pandemic response globally has demonstrated. And in the absence of intentional justice, fairness, and equity action, privileged communities can improve their positions at the continued expense of marginalized communities. So benefits of the policies are measured not only by GDP, but rather by household income security. So, and then Abby Willard had success will look like a climate action plan that addresses both mitigation and restoration of our overburdened communities and strategies that proactively maintain equitable treatment of all communities in our efforts, programs, and investments going forward. I think a lot of the question around what is just transitions does come from the spirit of what we're trying to put within the charter, and as well as the recommendations we're going to come forth with. So this is a useful conversation, but just keeping in mind as well that we're not at ground zero of coming up with a definition for just transitions, that some of us kind of feel that sort of inherently in our bones as to what's going to be necessary to make this work meaningful. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. These are getting at, how you want to define equity, how you want to define justice. And I think that's going to be one of the things you'll do as part of this principles process, is starting to use definitions that really work for you all. Are there other things folks want to say now about this? Things that haven't been put in the chat or said? Danielle, if you're talking, I can't hear you. No? Okay. Sorry.
This is Chris. I'm not exactly sure how to characterize this, but I'll just take a stab at it. There will be groups, just like the folk who are on the corner in by Piney Park in Brattleboro, who are going to try to make us afraid to do this work and make the state afraid to do this work. When the policies come out, there are going to be people who are going to threaten with violence and disruption and other things. We've got to build, so hopefully if we do this work right, we're going to have a strong enough public as a whole to stand up to whatever is going to be coming as these policies are proposed and implemented. And that means that and that's going to be part of, what we're calling fairness and, and justice and just transitions. Others are going to look at as an assault on them. And we're going to have to be able to stand ready so that, just as we've been able to, recognize racism in this country and in this state, we're going to have to be ready to respond to folk who are going to act on those same racist and other tendencies, white supremacist tendencies. Hate to put that out there, but that's where we're at, and we always have been.
Yeah. Liz?
Hi there. One thing that keeps coming to mind for me is just the fact that meeting each community and identity group and career field, whatever it is, like where they're at, and that each of these, groups has their own unique needs and anxieties and loops that they're going to have to jump through as a part of this process, and just recognizing like that there's no one size fits all transition. And so that the guidance that we're going to have to provide has to make sense for each group, and just kind of trying to keep that at the forefront. But as far as defining it, that transition, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if any of us knows, and it's something that we're going to have to keep, working towards together. But those are just my thoughts at the moment.
Thanks. Yeah. Other reactions, thoughts? Abby?
Thanks. I wonder if this is not it's kind of a squishy piece, but it kind of speaks to what Sarah and Chris have both suggested. I wonder if there's a component and a success factor that's around creating the culture for these types of conversations. So it's just that creating the space and the need to invest in the process, which other committees are going to be frustrated by the fact that we are going to slow them down, and that these issues are going to take more time, and they're going to have to rethink everything or some parts of what they proposed through this lens. And so maybe allowing the time and the space and that culture shift for this to become more of the norm is a valuable piece to just ask for and expect as an outcome of the work.
Mm. Really interesting. Mm. Great. Anything else folks want to say? I might share my screen in just a second to show you what I've been writing, and then maybe that'll spark some additional thoughts. Again, we're getting at the raw material for your guiding principles. That's where we're headed right now, is we're trying to find that raw material. Maybe I'll share my screen just for a second, see if it's helpful, and see if this gets us thinking about some bigger themes. Just give me 1 second, it'll just take a moment.
I think Kaya's hand is up, unless that's an old hand up.
I think it's an old one.
It is old.
So I was taking some notes and trying to cut and paste some things from the chat, so it's a little bit sloppy, but there's some themes about understanding structurally what's going on, what has gone on in our country, in our state, your state, and taking steps towards overcoming that, right? And that gets to the systemic issues, right? And you have these dual systemic things you're working on, right? The systemic inequalities around race, around class, around quality, income. And then you also have the climate and energy issues that are very systemic in our culture, right? And so this fear of not becoming some sort of token, right? And then this last point about, we should help by creating the kind of culture that's needed to do these conversations and to go there, right? So more people are walking with us and fewer are getting seduced by those who might reject these kinds of conversations. There's definitions around equity and justice that I heard you wanting to do. There's wanting to have nuance to understand what these messages and what these ideas mean for different sectors. We want to understand also, we need some definitional pieces like really who are we talking about on certain issues in terms of frontline communities, right? And that's also related to identifying winners and losers of existing policy and future potential policy that your other subcommittees might come up with, right? And that part of that identification in the future is saying, let's rethink what we want for workers in the state and the kinds of conditions we're aiming for as part of our pathway towards less economic inequity, and the specific idea about what we're actually measuring. And then there's a series of ideas about walking together in terms of the climate goals with the justice and equity goals, and then some of those pieces from the chat, which I just took and cut and paste. So these are sort of emerging ideas. They're not particularly well organized, but I'm wondering, when you see them together, are you seeing the genesis of guiding principles? Are you seeing sort of what's going on that would be the kinds of big ideas you want to put in front of other subcommittees? Is there something there you can already start to name?
Ask that question again, David. Sorry.
Sure. When you look at what you're saying right now, are you starting to see emerge what might start to become a guiding principle? The kinds of things you'd want to put in front of one of the subcommittees.
There's something that came to mind that's maybe not what you're asking exactly, but something that came up at the council meeting on Monday, and maybe this is something we want to give as a guiding principle, is re-examining existing policies, because a lot of the work will be easier if we just keep doing what we've been doing and more. But some of those existing policies and programs might be driving inequality, and that's something that's going to be maybe the toughest thing we have to remind other committees is, like, I know you love this program. You understand it's hurting this subset of the population.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So let me stop sharing my screen.
David,
Yeah.
I was just thinking, there's this tension on this timeline that we're grappling with, and our sort of deep desire that I continue to hear as a principle for early and ongoing engagement at each level of the process. And then a continued hearing, like, that's not in statute. We have to make sure we do what's in statute, but that's like icing on the cake. And I feel like what I want to hold is that this committee, puts out maybe in our guiding principles, like, that's not icing on the cake. That's like fundamental. So that's the kind of like play that, like, I'm wondering in my mind, like, those kind of things that we can use these guiding principles to just anchor it and say, nope, that's actually fundamental. It's not icing.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Right. So if folks want to keep going on this, we can keep going a little bit. If folks are kind of done with this and want to sit with it for a little bit, we could, when we send the notes, maybe we'll send it with a little question that might be something that looks a little bit like homework in terms of sort of, if these are some initial thoughts we had, what does that mean in terms of what I'd want to put in front of another subcommittee as a guiding principle? So I think maybe we could do that at your own time as well, and just sort of think about that for a little bit. The other piece is how well in our notes here are we naming what we mean by equity or by justice, right? Are we naming it? And I think some of the language that you put together in your charter and your charge goes at that as well. I remember, Kaya, the importance you put on restorative, the piece of this, in addition to the equity piece of it. And so that's the kind of thing where I'd want to have you all make sure you're getting that out there in a way that feels right to each of you. All right. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Wait, you're on.
I appreciate that. So I did want to actually, I liked the opening question, both this question and the opening question where we began saying, how are you feeling the impacts of our climate crisis within your community, right? I would like an opportunity to speak a little bit more with specificity on that. And I think it might be important as well, if it's possible for some of the subcommittee members that are coming from most impacted communities to have an opportunity to articulate that a little bit more deeply. Because even saying, what is your community? I could talk about where I physically live right now, or I could talk about what this means for people who might have the same, who come from the same descendancy. It could be people from the same income stratification, from whatever those touch points are for how I call community. But like, that might be really important for us to hear and to see within this process. And I know that's something that maybe as chairs we can work on, but I think as a committee, I think it's a great question to ask. It's hard to ask on the fly.
Yeah.
And to really truly give the depth and fidelity that we'd like to telling those stories. So I just wanted to name that as something that if, we can continue to work on if it seems like it's of value to people.
Absolutely. And I think even going one step further than that, Kai, I feel like having your own experience about what it's like when someone just throws that question at you, like, what's going on with you in the climate, and knowing, I need a little space to think about it, that can help shape the way you want to go out and do public engagement, right? Because you may do public engagement very differently than like, let's go have a meeting and ask people how the climate crisis is feeling. Like, you may need to do something different that allows people to get to that place of what's really going on with them. So I that's a really interesting thing to talk about next week as well.
I think there's also trying to figure out the space on how to be really honest about some of the hard truths that we got to deal with. One of the things that keeps going through my mind, this is more of a bigger process thing, but in my world, I keep looking at Vermont's very diffuse planning process, and I keep trying to figure out how are we going to implement this. If it's under the current rubric where there's a lot of discussion, frequently in the legislature and elsewhere, in the interest of inclusion and local engagement, by saying, let's have the towns work on this. And what I keep seeing are towns that do not have the capacity to do this kind of work at all. Select boards are good at developing budgets and implementing budgets. They're not always, the best entities to then put on them really complex planning and implementation tasks. And, if they don't have that capacity and, this process goes, and we start saying, okay, leave it to the towns to figure this out and do the public engagement, most of them just do not have the capacity to do that. And that's that's something that I may get in trouble for having just said that. But we just need to address some of the, there's some serious structural issues, in addition to, class and gender and race and other things that just how we function that we're going to really have to get at to make this whole policy rubric work. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. All right. So, it seems to me we might be getting to a natural conclusion, although I would welcome folks that haven't spoken up yet, that if you have something that's on your mind related to this is a great time to share it. So if you haven't really weighed in on this and you've been noodling on it in your head, it's a good time to share that if you want to.
I just want to say that Beverly did call in, but she, for some reason, can't participate, but she's listening in. She's let me know by email. So.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, that's frustrating. All right. Anything else folks want to weigh in on? Okay. Excellent. So why don't we do this? Why don't we do, if there are members of the public who want to join, and I get a little muddled up on this call, who's a member of the public and who is a member of the subcommittee anyway, so I apologize. But if there are members of the public who have been diligently holding off until commenting, this is a great time now. Let's do a little comment and then we'll finish our business up at the very end. So folks who are joining us as observers today, would you like to, is there anything you'd like to say?
Hi, this is Pat Sagwe.
Hi, Pat.
Hi, I'm going to try to turn this camera on. Great, I think that works. A couple things that occurred to me listening to all this, and just a lot of really good ideas and encouraging to hear. It seems it would be helpful to understand what the council's sort of what their decision-making tree, for lack of a better word, is going to be, and if this committee had a visual of that and then could identify, all right, these are the places where we want to insert just transition things. And I don't know if that will ever be possible, but just it's still feeling kind of clunky, and so that was sort of the visual that came to me. And the other thing is, and maybe that would get to it, but it's the boundary of just transition, and a couple people alluded to it, referencing who are the winners and losers, and there are winners and losers that don't live in Vermont. And are we not going to talk about people who live where materials are being mined that allow certain technologies? Are we, and it would be really helpful to me as a participant in this process, as a member of the public, to sort of understand where our justice interest ends. Is it anyone who would be affected by the decisions that we make and how we move forward, or is it just the people of Vermont that we're talking about? And that would be a really useful clarification to get at some point, not necessarily today. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for sharing that. Are there other comments from folks who are observing our meeting today? Great. Okay. All right. So I know that Sarah has a couple things she needs to do to help finish up. I think it's all that I wanted to do, just to say we started some conversations today, and these are things that you're going to keep going on in the coming weeks. And I'll certainly share my notes, and so that the minutes that go out can include the notes I just took, as well as those slides I shared, if those can be helpful. But with that, I'll turn it over back to Sarah and say, what are our next steps, and what is how are we going to finish up tonight?
Thanks, David. I had a couple business things that I failed to bring up at the beginning. I apologize. So one is that Kitiara Casey, I believe her last name is, was named as a member of our subcommittee, and she was very interested in participating. And after a few different ways of attempting to connect with her, we haven't been able to connect with her to have her participate. I think she would have brought a really valuable perspective of, you know, of Vermonters living on very low income. And her son, I believe, also has a disability. So I don't know if we want to, she hasn't been able to participate to date. We haven't been able to connect with her. And so Sue and I wanted to bring to this group whether or not we want to have her exit the subcommittee and potentially look for someone else to represent, or just folks' thoughts on how we want to proceed there. I think it's fair to say that she's not going to be participating at this point, but happy to talk more about that and hear other perspectives. And just to say, Sue thought that she did have somebody, for instance, from Capstone's Head Start Policy Council that she might be able to approach to see if we did still want someone to participate with that lived experience.
Any guidance for Sarah on that, folks?
Okay, we can, maybe folks can think about it and we can come back to it at the next meeting. I don't know that we need to act on it now. And just to also say, I believe that people who did not yet have a State of Vermont email account, that those were getting established this week, and hopefully you've got that started. And so I'm going to start using those in the meeting invite and then stop using your personal emails. But I don't want to lose anyone in that process. So feel free to just let me know if you can. Just ping me and say, my state email is working, take the other one off. I'm happy to do that. That'd be helpful.
And Sarah, just as I'll share with you a new distribution list tomorrow, because that was my goal, to produce them. So then you'll have it, and anybody people have been reaching out to me if they've had problems. So hopefully they'll be all corrected by tomorrow.
Okay, great.
I see a hand up. Amanda, do you have a question?
No, I just wanted to bring up that, just to refresh your memory, my name is Amanda. I work with Sue at Capstone, and I've kind of been acting administratively for this committee. And Sarah and Sue asked that we start putting together a kind of a bibliography of resources for our subcommittee. So this is some resources that you saw in the slideshow that Ellery did a couple weeks ago, some of those references, but also as just a forum to share articles and things that we think are interesting and relevant to our work. So I will post that shared Google document in the chat and also put it in the meeting notes so people can contribute what they like and look over other resources people have shared.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. Great. Anything else to finish up today? Okay. Great. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. We dipped our toe in the water today and started to do that. It started to go there. And so thanks for doing that. I'm happy to help periodically if I'm helpful. And Sarah, I'll leave it to you to finish up.
All right, thanks, David. Yeah, really appreciate you leaning into facilitate today. So I think, unless I think we're wrapping it up, I don't know that we had anything else on our agenda. Okay,
we're done.
I think we're good. I think we'll call it a day, and Nadia and Kaya and Sue and I will meet to sort of scope out, work on fleshing out that work plan a little bit more based on the conversation today, and timeline to bring back next week. Hopefully next week we'll be meeting with the public engagement contractor, maybe even if they're not official yet, they might, but hopefully we'll be doing that and digging into public engagement and starting to map out our work a little bit more than 1 week at a time. So really appreciate everyone participating today, and thanks. Have a great night.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Have a good night.